The image you have of God's dwelling in the desert is probably incomplete. Popular tradition and centuries of history have shaped the vision of a golden, silent tent, surrounded by the vastness of sand, with heavy curtains and sacred objects shining softly in the lamplight. All of this, in fact, existed. This is the structure that the book of Exodus describes in detail, with its 45 feet in length, solid acacia wood walls overlaid with pure gold, and an impenetrable veil separating the rooms. But the original Hebrew text uses a very strict word to define this place, Mishkan. And contrary to what almost all of Western history has assumed, this word does not mean temple. It means a temporary dwelling. And this ancient distinction changes absolutely everything that happened inside, far from the eyes of the crowd, between the years 1440 and 1400 before Christ. What occupied the geometric center of that camp in the Sinai desert was not just an isolated sanctuary for sacrificial rituals. It was the exact structure that operated the logistical and political miracle of transforming nearly 2 million disorganized former slaves into a functional and relentless nation. And the most baffling detail of this inhospitable architecture is that the most important object guarded in the darkness of that tent was not the most sacred relic. The narrative that survived the test of time documents a division of space that allowed for no failures. An outer courtyard surrounded by white linen, where the continuous smoke of offerings stained the desert sky. The holy place, a dense corridor of incense smoke, with access restricted strictly to priests of direct lineage. And on the far opposite end, the ultimate space, the Holy of Holies, a chamber isolated from the outside world by a thick curtain, carefully woven in 4 exact colors, being blue, purple, crimson, and fine linen. It was in the center of this absolute darkness that the Ark of the Covenant rested, heavy and invisible beneath the shadow of golden cherubim. No ordinary man ever saw what lay on the other side of that veil. Crossing that limit outside the prescribed time did not result in human judgment, nor in any kind of mercy. The warning recorded in the text of Leviticus was lethal and non-negotiable. A single, unauthorized step into the Holy of Holies, one breath at the wrong moment, and the intruder met his tragic and irreversible end in that very second. This impassable barrier of separation is usually interpreted today merely as a harsh demand for purity. But the documentary precision of the time points to a much deeper mechanism. That isolation was not just spiritual. It was the foundation of a new axis of power in the middle of nowhere, guarding an internal mechanism that dictated day after day whether the tribes of Israel would continue to exist as a people or if they would disappear forever into the dust of the Sinai. The version of events that survived the millennia and reached us was meticulously recorded in the texts of the book of Exodus. And the preserved narrative builds an image of weight and reverence, a complex portable structure divided into 3 levels of holiness, designed with a mathematical precision that accepted no improvisation of any kind. The first level was the outer courtyard, a vast open area surrounded by heavy curtains of pure white linen, supported by dozens of solid bronze pillars that shone intensely under the unforgiving desert sun. That was where the congregation stopped. It was the absolute limit allowed for the common man. In this open courtyard, the sound of glowing coals consuming the offerings on the great bronze altar, and the sound of water being moved in the purification basin dominated the environment, mixing with the constant smell of smoke and sacrifice. But beyond this courtyard and this daily movement rose the solid walls of the tabernacle itself, massive boards of acacia wood entirely overlaid with pure gold, perfectly fitted over silver bases. And there began the second level of isolation, the holy place, a restricted and silent environment where the natural light of the sun never entered. The darkness was broken only by the continuous flames of a solid gold lampstand with 7 branches. Under this dense half-light, only the consecrated priests moved. They walked in absolute silence, passed by the golden table that held the 12 loaves of the presence, and fed the coals of the incense altar, creating a thick and perfumed cloud that rose to the ceiling without interruption. And then, at the end of this dark corridor, you reached the final frontier, the Holy of Holies. This environment was separated from the rest of the tent by a dense, heavy veil, perfectly woven with threads of 4 exact colors: blue, purple, crimson, and fine twined linen. Behind this impassable barrier rested the ultimate object of Hebrew history, the Ark of the Covenant, a wooden ark shielded in gold, covered by the sacred mercy seat and guarded by the outstretched wings of 2 cherubim cast from the same metal. The rule of access was clear. Only the high priest possessed the authority to pull back that veil, and this could only happen on a single occasion in the Jewish calendar year, the Great Day of Atonement. He crossed the border carrying the blood of the sacrifice and wrapped in a curtain of incense smoke, ensuring he did not look directly at the divine glory. The warning that the book of Leviticus in its 16th chapter verse 2 gives to Aaron and to all his priestly successors was definitive. Passing through that 4-colored curtain outside the exact prescribed moment was not a forgivable mistake. The consequence was the immediate loss of human life. This unyielding separation between the vast camp of Israel, the intermediate priestly class, and the most restricted space of the enclosure is usually interpreted today as a simple purity ritual, or even the superstition of an ancient people. But it was not. Those curtains, those bronze pillars, and those golden utensils did not serve merely to isolate the deity. That tent was the physical, tactile, and non-negotiable architecture of the covenant that Moses carried down from the mountain. It was the structural blueprint of a government that did not yet possess land, but already possessed unbreakable laws. Before we push forward through the harsh sands of the Sinai to understand how 2 million former slaves managed to erect such a complex work of engineering in the middle of nowhere, I ask you quickly to leave your like. This tells the platform that this documentary holds historical value, and it helps us immensely to continue investigating these ancient narratives to bring the best content to you. And so I can better understand who is walking with us today in this analysis. Leave your answer right here in the comments. What draws your attention the most in this kind of documentary? Do you like studying the symbols of the Old Testament to deepen your own faith? Are you fascinated by the engineering and survival skills of ancient peoples in the desert? Or do you simply love unraveling the historical facts forgotten by modern architecture? I will read and answer every comment with great respect and attention. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, let us return to the rigors of that desert and discover the true cost behind the dwelling place of God. The Sinai Desert was never a territory made for human survival. Between the years 1440 and 1400 before Christ, the inhospitable landscape offered nothing more than sharp stones, coarse sand, and an empty horizon that seemed to crush any trace of life. Erecting the tabernacle in that environment of absolute desolation was not just a logistical challenge. From a technical standpoint, it was completely impossible. The maintenance of nearly 2 million former slaves already represented a challenge of unimaginable proportions. It was a gigantic human mass in constant motion, with no access to permanent water sources, walking along routes with no pasture for the animals, and depending exclusively on the manna gathered at every dawn. Demanding that this exhausted crowd stop long enough to build and manage a complex structure, which required high-precision carpentry and meticulous weaving of finely dyed threads, went against the basic instinct of survival in the desert. The dimension of the impossible becomes physical when we examine the records from the book of Exodus in chapter 38. The text presents an inventory of materials that defies the reality of a fugitive people. The construction consumed approximately 2,200 pounds of pure gold, 7,500 pounds of silver, and more than 5,300 pounds of bronze. All of this colossal metallic cargo needed to be melted, cast, hammered, and molded with millimeter precision. And this highly complex industrial process took place out in the open, under extreme weather conditions, where temperatures in the Sinai could surpass 113 degrees Fahrenheit under the midday sun, only to plummet to near freezing during the early hours of the morning. There were no industrial ovens. There were no structured foundries. There was no room for error in pieces that needed to fit perfectly into heavy silver bases weighing 75 pounds each, without the use of a single fixing nail. The factual explanation that sustains the execution of this engineering reveals a profound irony in the history of the founding of Israel. The wealth that financed the dwelling of the Hebrew God was not mined in the desert. It was extracted directly from the heart of the empire that enslaved them. The 12th chapter of Exodus documents that, moments before their final departure, the Israelites emptied the reserves of Egypt, taking with them an immeasurable amount of gold, silver, and fine fabrics. The material spoils of the oppressing nation became the exact raw material of the new sanctuary. But the raw material would be useless without the intellect capable of shaping it in the sand. It is at this point that the narrative brings the names of Bezalel and Oholiab in chapter 31. These men did not learn to master gold and silver while walking as nomads. They carried the architectural knowledge and metallurgical mastery of Egypt itself, the most advanced techniques of the ancient world. The long and painful period of captivity did not serve only to weigh upon the shoulders of the Hebrews. It rigorously trained the minds and hands of the craftsmen who would build the heart of Israel. The deep knowledge acquired under the authority of Pharaoh was the exact tool used to forge the symbol of their own freedom. The book of Exodus, starting from its 25th chapter, does not give the reader a poetic account or a soft narrative. It presents a technical manual, cold, direct, and calculated down to the inch. The instruction recorded right in the 8th verse establishes the premise of the entire operation that would follow: "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." At first glance, the modern mind projects the image of a traditional temple, But the original Hebrew text uses a word of surgical precision to define this structure. The term is mishkan, derived from the verbal root shakan, which literally means to dwell temporarily. The copyists and guardians of the Masoretic text maintained this distinction 139 times in the scriptures, ensuring that the reader would never confuse the desert tent with a hekal, the Hebrew word reserved for palaces or temples of a fixed foundation of immovable stones. The tabernacle, by its very nature, was not born to stand still in the sand. It was a dwelling in a constant state of readiness. And before we detail the physical, brutal, and crushing weight that it was to dismantle and carry this architecture through the desert, I want to take a brief pause for you who love studying the real context of the scriptures. Often we read these historical accounts in a fragmented way, and we end up losing the exact notion of where they fit into the grand map of time. That is why I highly recommend reading the ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order.pdf. This material brilliantly reorganizes history, allowing you to comprehend the historical sequence of biblical events, see the prophetic connections that span the centuries, and understand the guiding thread of redemption from Genesis to Revelation. The link for you to check out this material is right below in the description. It is a fundamental tool for anyone who wishes to organize their mind and heart in the deep study of the Word. Returning to the rigor of the Sinai camp, the mathematics of the Mishkan were relentless and defied the laws of ancient logistics. The inner enclosure measured exactly 45 feet long by 15 feet wide and 15 feet high. The walls were not formed by thin curtains swaying in the wind, as the movies usually portray. They were built with 48 solid boards of acacia wood. Acacia was one of the few woods available in the barrenness of that region, known for its extreme density and natural resistance against time. Each of these heavy boards was an impressive 15 feet high by 27 inches wide, and they were entirely overlaid with pure gold. But the soft and unstable desert sand offered no firmness to erect walls of this magnitude. The engineering solution relied on the extreme weight of silver. The 26th chapter of Exodus details that each golden board had 2 perfect tenons at the bottom, which slid down and locked into solid bases of cast silver. In total, there were 96 silver bases just for the main enclosure. Each of these bases weighed around 75 pounds. They formed an armored and unshakable foundation, outlining a closed rectangle on 3 sides, whose only front opening was protected by embroidered curtains. There was not a single fixing nail in the structure. Everything was kept standing through a complex system of golden rings and horizontal acacia bars that joined the boards, transforming isolated pieces into a fortress held together by the purest physical tension. Modern illustrations fail deeply in presenting the tent to us as a serene and motionless work. They ignore the harsh mechanical reality imposed by the 4th chapter of the book of Numbers. The camp had no will of its own. Whenever the cloud of the divine presence rose and moved over the 12 tribes, the entire nation had to break camp, and the colossal structure of the sanctuary had to disappear into the dust and hit the road. The dismantling process was a logistical operation of the highest risk. The priests, direct descendants of Aaron, entered the restricted enclosure first. They had the duty to cover every sacred piece of furniture with blue and purple cloths and durable hides of marine animals, isolating the lethality of divine holiness from the eyes of the common people. Looking at the uncovered Ark of the Covenant was not a forgivable mistake. The text is clear in stating that inappropriate visual contact with the sacred brought the immediate and irreversible loss of life. Only after this absolute visual isolation did the families of the tribe of Levi take on the physical weight of the nation. Thousands of heavy golden boards, 75-pound silver bases, solid bronze pillars, and dozens of yards of linen curtains were brutally detached from the ground. The Merarite family was responsible for the heavy structural load, using massive wooden carts pulled by oxen. The Gershonite family gathered the fabrics, veils, and coverings, but the Kohathite family faced the greatest burden of all. They carried the sacred objects of the dwelling not in carts, but upon their own shoulders, walking through the hot sand with the golden furniture supported entirely by poles of acacia wood. Under the suffocating heat that easily surpassed 104 degrees Fahrenheit, that shimmering mountain of metal and wood descended to the ground in a matter of hours. The Levites marched, carrying tons of material over uneven terrain, aware of a non-negotiable rule. Before the extreme, freezing cold took over the early morning in the desert, and before absolute darkness blinded the camp, every piece had to be unloaded. Every heavy silver base had to be aligned to the millimeter in the sand, and every gold overlaid acacia board had to be raised and fitted again, restoring the sanctuary exactly as it was the day before. They dismantled, carried, and rebuilt the dwelling of God over and over again for years on end. The original Hebrew text never dared to call it a temple, because no building of stone would be able to withstand this relentless level of friction, assembly, and continuous displacement, and still remain intact in the geometric center of the people, dictating the rhythm of survival for 2 million souls under the harsh Sinai sky. When night fell over the immensity of the Sinai desert and the campfires were lit before the tents, an aerial view of that camp would reveal something completely terrifying to any spy from an ancient empire. Nearly 2 million people were not scattered randomly or chaotically across the unforgiving sands. They were mathematically organized. The second chapter of the book of Numbers details a military and civil formation of extreme rigor. 3 tribes camped to the north, 3 tribes to the south, 3 to the east, and 3 to the west. And in the exact center of this massive human gear, like the pulsating core of a living machine, rested the Tabernacle. The Hebrew word used in the 8th verse of the 25th chapter of Exodus, when the divine instruction determines that I may dwell among them, carries a geographic, strategic, and political weight far greater than our modern reading usually grasps. The original expression betokem means literally, in their geometric center. The deity who pulled them from absolute servitude was not isolated on the top of an unreachable mountain, nor did he intend to rule from the top of a stone ziggurat surrounded by armed guards. The physical and dusty center of the camp became the absolute center of national power. And it is at this exact point, looking at the heavy curtains and the smoke-stained bronze pillars, that the story you have always heard needs to be rewritten and deepened in your mind. If you ask any casual historian or any reader of the ancient scriptures, what was the most important piece guarded inside that inhospitable dwelling, the answer will be immediate and almost instinctive. Everyone will say it was the Ark of the Covenant, and from the standpoint of ceremonial rigor, reverential awe, and the weight of divine glory? That answer is perfectly correct. The ark of acacia and solid gold was the absolute limit of the sacred, the physical point of contact between the unfathomable eternity and the dust of the earth. But Israel's journey through the desert was not sustained only by moments of ecstasy and spiritual contemplation. It was an exhausting, harsh, and continuous narrative of human survival and social organization. That monumental mass of former slaves desperately needed something that would prevent their psychological and political fragmentation. Egypt had tried to steal their identity, reducing them to mere brick builders. They needed a practical, uninterrupted, and visible mechanism that would remind them day after day that they were no longer fugitive captives, but rather the legitimate citizens of a newborn nation. And the object directly responsible for maintaining this complex cohesion, the true structural pillar of the people, did not rest in the impenetrable darkness of the Holy of Holies. It was in the preceding room, positioned just before the great veil. In the holy place, it was the table of the showbread. While the Ark of the Covenant remained invisible and hidden for an entire year, being accessed in a tense and dangerous manner only on the great Day of Atonement, the golden table of the bread was the scene of an incessant operation, vital to the breath of the nation. The 24th chapter of the book of Leviticus records a fascinating order that is profoundly ignored by our time. Exactly 12 loaves of bread needed to be baked with flour of the highest quality and placed upon that table, carefully divided into 2 rows of 6. And this was not an annual delivery or a distant mystical rite. Every 7th day of the week, the great day of rest, without allowing for any excuse or interruption, the old loaves needed to be consumed by the priests and immediately replaced with fresh, warm bread. But why bread? In the ancient world, the pagan peoples who inhabited the lands around Canaan and Egypt had the primitive custom of placing dishes of food on their great stone altars. They did this because they feared their gods would feel hungry and need to be nourished by the trembling hands of human beings. The God of Israel, described from Genesis to Revelation as the maker of the constellations and the deep waters, obviously did not need wheat baked in human fire. That bread did not have the primary function of nourishing the deity. That bread was the civil, historical, and political registry of the Hebrew people. Each of the 12 loaves represented, in a physical, palpable, and undeniable way, one of the 12 tribes originating from the sons of Jacob. Every week, those in charge needed to harvest and provide the best flour. Every week, the priests of Levitical lineage needed to knead the wheat, watch the fire, and deposit the sacred food before the 4-colored curtain. The smell of warm bread invaded the room and mixed with the dense and permanent perfume of the incense. Those 12 loaves were never mere decorative ornaments of an extinct liturgy. They were the material, hard proof, renewed every 7 days, that the 12 tribes still existed, still endured the rigor of the climate, still walked together, and still formed an indivisible and lethal unity. As long as the 12 loaves were whole upon the table, Israel still breathed as a living nation. If any of those tribes were decimated by the brutal heat and cruel thirst of the Sinai, or if any tribe gave in to panic and decided to abandon the military formation in the middle of the night to try and return to the flesh pots of Egypt, the consequence would be immediate, tactile, and exposed to the eyes of the leadership. A loaf would be missing from the golden table. The ancient promise made to the patriarchs would be broken, and the integrity of that society's foundation would be fractured forever. The temporary dwelling operated a true sociological miracle upon a traumatized generation who still had the sound of the Egyptian taskmaster's whips echoing in their memory. This silent mechanism in the middle of the wasteland transformed previously scattered and bitter men into a rigidly connected national structure, dependent on a single center. And it did this through an absurdly simple, organic, and perishable object, which demanded continuous loyalty and dedication. Collective identity, for those struggling not to perish in the sandstorms, was not maintained by grand theoretical speeches. The historical survival of Israel was pure and simple maintenance. It depended on the manual, exhausting effort to harvest, grind, bake, and reaffirm before the sky, week after week, that they were still one single and powerful people. The sacred tent was definitely not just a ritual environment for the forgiveness of human flaws. It operated as the first fully functional state institution of that era. It forged, in pain and sweat, the minds of thousands of families who did not have an inch of ground to call their own, teaching them that their true homeland did not yet possess walls or borders drawn on papyrus. The invincible homeland of Israel was the very presence of God, and it walked in a heavy, dense, and absolutely sovereign manner in the center of the life of every man and woman. The same invisible principle that sustained 2 million Hebrews on the scorching sands of the Sinai continues to govern humanity to this day. History teaches us that nations do not survive long crises based solely on demarcated borders. They survive through symbols, and centralized religious structures possess an incomparable psychological and political power to transform disorder into absolute cohesion. If you observe the modern world closely, you will see the reflection of Moses' tent operating on a grand scale. The model designed in the desert never stopped working. The Kaaba, located in Mecca, operates under a structural logic incredibly similar to what the table of the showbread represented to the Israelites. It is a physical central object that forces millions of people scattered across the globe to turn their faces to a single geometric point, 5 times a day. This daily repetition, directed toward the same geography, is not just an isolated act of devotion. It is the relentless maintenance of a collective identity, uniting individuals who have never met each other through a single center. The imposing St. Peter's Basilica, in the heart of the Vatican, centralizes over 1,300,000,000 faithful, using the same architectural foundation of isolation and authority that we saw in the desert sanctuary. There, power and tradition are concentrated in a monumental building where only rigorously credentialed figures of authority can access the deepest spaces. Contact with sacred relics remains hierarchical and restricted, but the most perfect and moving mirror of this ancient model rests in the ancient city of Jerusalem. The state of Israel had to rebuild its cohesion around an immense fragment of stone. The well-known Wailing Wall functions today as the tactile substitute for the original Tabernacle. It is the last remnant of the Second Temple complex, which met its tragic end when the Roman general Titus besieged the city in the year 70 A.D. In that terrible year, the monumental structure erected by King Herod was completely destroyed, leaving not one stone upon another, and the population was taken into captivity or fell before the relentless sword of Rome. The heavy stones of the wall that resisted this merciless onslaught of the empire keep Jews from all over the world permanently connected. That ancient massive wall sustains the memory of a people who spent countless generations scattered, but who never forgot where their center of worship had been planted. However, there is a fundamental difference, a true logistical abyss, between the tabernacle forged in the Sinai and all these gigantic structures of the present. Imposing mosques, secular cathedrals, and stone walls depend on a fixed geography. They are bound to the soil. If the territory is invaded and dominated by enemies, the main symbol runs the risk of collapsing. The divine genius handed down to the Hebrew people was infinitely superior. The sanctuary built in the desert was not vulnerable to prolonged geographical sieges, because the tabernacle carried the divine authority and glory sustained on poles of acacia wood. The nation did not yet possess a portion of land. They had no piece of ground to erect protective walls. Therefore, the sacred dwelling had to walk with them, bearing the weight of the climate and the exhaustion of the men. What Bezalel and Oholiab erected in the middle of the dust, under the strict instructions that came down from the mountain, was not just the embryo of a future building. They forged the first portable nation in human history. Wherever the feet of the priests stepped carrying that sanctuary, the center of the Hebrew universe was instantly established. And it is exactly to the unreachable heart of this mobile structure that our investigation needs to turn now, because the maintenance of identity was in the sacred and visible food of the holy place, but the definitive power capable of rebuilding or collapsing that entire society instantly still waited in the absolute dark. The entire complex structure of survival and maintenance of Israel's identity materialized in the showbread, paved the way for the absolute core of that camp. The temporary dwelling in the desert was not merely a center of social cohesion. It guarded, in its darkest, most silent, and inaccessible chamber, the object that unquestionably defined the final authority over the nation. Past the thick four-colored veil, in the dense isolation of the Holy of Holies, rested the Ark of the Covenant. The book of Exodus, in its 25th chapter, records the exact measurements of this piece. It was an ark of acacia wood measuring 45 inches long by 27 inches wide and 27 inches high. It was entirely armored with the purest gold available in the camp. Above it, the solid gold mercy seat served as the base for two cherubim with outstretched wings, cast into the same piece. Inside this relentless vault rested the tablets of the law that Moses brought from the mountain, Aaron's rod that flowered supernaturally, and a jar containing the manna that fed the former slaves. But to reduce the ark to a simple religious reliquary is a historical mistake. It was the most powerful political and military object in all of Hebrew antiquity. In the mindset of that era, whoever accompanied the ark walked under the physical, tactile cover of God Himself. This absolute dependency becomes evident when we analyze the first book of Samuel in its 4th chapter. In a moment of despair facing the relentless advance of the enemy army, the leaders of Israel made an extreme decision. They removed the ark from its isolated enclosure and took it directly to the battlefield against the Philistines, treating the divine presence as an automatic guarantee of victory. The human calculation failed bitterly. The Philistines not only overcame Israel's defenses, causing thousands of Hebrew warriors to fall tragically that day, but they captured the Ark of the Covenant itself. The impact of this loss among the people was not just the sorrow for the theft of a sacred symbol, it was an instant national collapse. Without the Ark, Israel felt they had lost the only material proof that glory still dwelt with them. As the centuries passed, the portable tent fulfilled its harsh purpose. The nation finally conquered its territory, established its borders, and, at the height of peace, King Solomon built the grandiose Temple of Stone in Jerusalem, sealing the Ark of the Covenant in the new and definitive Holy of Holies. And it is exactly at this point of stability that the history of Israel suffers its greatest and most baffling rupture. After the majesty of Solomon's reign, the Ark simply disappears. The biblical record goes disturbingly silent about the exact moment when the most important object of Israel's foundation was removed, hidden, or lost. When the Babylonian Empire invaded Jerusalem centuries later, completely destroying the temple, the meticulous inventory of looted treasures lists basins, pillars, and utensils, but it makes no mention of the Ark. What happened to the central piece of the divine covenant? Who hid it in the dead of night, and why was this monumental event erased from the direct records of that era? The lost answers behind this millennial silence reveal the greatest theological secret in the entire Old Testament. And this deep investigation, retracing the final steps of the Ark before its disappearance, is the story you need to watch right now by clicking the video that is appearing on your screen. Stay with us and discover the truth about humanity's most sought-after relic.